Hey, you Clear Lake peeps. Ross England here with Clear Lake Guide Service. Well, still no positive news. We're still in the holding pattern. Hope everybody that you know, including yourselves and your family, are healthy, getting through this okay. It's a mess beyond belief. Certainly nothing I've ever lived through my entire life. Certainly nothing Gracie's ever lived through. She's going just about as crazy as I am. There's really nothing to report on the lake because there's no news, and there won't be any news until possibly the first of the month. So what I thought I would do for you, and just a real brief recap, the lake is closed. All ways, shape, and form. No boats, no bank fishing, etc. So there's been no changes in that, and there probably won't be until maybe the first part of May. We'll see. I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not looking at this whole thing very optimistically right now. It's kind of hard to from a lot of our positions. So what I thought I'd do is I'd say, okay, so what's going on? Well, it's April. It means fish are spawning. Let's take a positive slant and let's say that maybe we're going to get back on the water in May. So how are we going to approach fishing Clear Lake in May? My approach is going to be real simple. Never heard that before. And, this isn't the only way to go about it. This is just the way that I would go about it. And the reasoning behind that is really simple. Okay, we're looking at the first part of May, which means April, pretty much the fish have been spawning on the upper end of the lake for an entire month. Once we get through the entire month of April, it isn't that the fish don't continue to spawn up on that end of the lake. I've actually caught bedfish as late as 4th of July weekend up here in Lakeport. So, a big part of it just is how clear is the water. They're going to spawn for 3 months. It's just a matter of how clear the water is and can you actually see them. This year will be interesting because the lake's 3 feet lower than it should be. Full is 7.5. It's at roughly 4.5. So you got 3 feet less water, which usually, if we have good conditions, means really good clarity. But not, who knows? The wind is howling outside right now, so I don't think the clarity is very good wherever it's blowing from or to right now. But generally speaking, April, you've already got a lot of fish that have spawned up on the upper end of the lake. They usually spawn in the upper end of the lake first, and then they move down, and then it's kind of the other two ends of the lake get going. There's a few exceptions to that, which I'm not going to go into, but for the most part, if I was looking for bedfish, April I'm going to look in the upper end of the lake. May I'm going to start looking down below. Usually the water's a little bit clearer down there, a little bit longer, so it's a little bit easier to see. It's also, more importantly, easier to see deeper down there. So it's a little bit it's a little bit more productive when you're spending a lot of time looking for the right fish, better fish, just not going down the bank looking for anything sitting on a bed. So we're going to take this from two different slants. One is just fishing, and the other is obviously sight fishing. Number one, doesn't make any difference either way. I'll be using a drop shot. When this time of year comes around and the fish are on beds, you just can't beat this thing. You really can't, because you can fling it around and it'll catch fish that, whether you see a bed or not. If you just find areas that you think you might see a bed in, toss this in there. Very high percentage bait for us. I don't get so hung up on colors. I mean, this is just the basic RoboWorm MM3. You'll notice it's in a smaller worm. That's my preference. Some guys prefer the bigger one. I'm just going to keep talking about what my preference is. The other thing that you might notice here, see how short that dropper is? That's only about 6 inches. And there's a reason for that. That 6-inch dropper is so as I'm casting out to either bed fish or fish that I can see. With that shorter dropper, that bait's right in their eyes. I mean, it is right in their face. These fish usually around beds aren't sitting up high in the water column. They're usually sitting down on the bottom. If not actually touching the bottom, sometimes they may be just within a couple of inches. So by making that bait, that dropper a little bit shorter, what I'm doing is I'm presenting a more challenging presentation to the fish. They see that thing coming eye to eye to them as opposed to going over their heads. So that's one of the reasons why we use that shorter dropper. Hook size 1, size 2, either one, Gamakatsu drop shot hook. And the good thing about it is if you fish it patiently, you'll get bit. I mean, plain and simple. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the most effective way to catch bed fish. Number 2. And you can fish these either on a spinning rod or a bait caster. Two little bait combinations. One, they're both Senkos. This is a 5-inch thin Senko. It's got a small bullet sinker on it. I think it's about a 1/8 rig, Texas rig. And of course you can do the same thing with a 5-inch regular Senko. There's two basic ways two basic ways you can fish these this time of year. One is Texas rig, drag it along the bottom, and the other way is to wacky rig it. She's helping. Wacky rig it so it's hanging like this. Usually you can, there's a couple different ways you can go about doing this. They make harnesses for this. They make weedless hooks for this. You can take a rubber band and go around it to be able to hook, a hook in it. But the idea is you have two different ways to fish a Senko. There's many of them, but this time of year, two different ways. One is the Texas rig that you're just going to drag real slowly along the bottom. The other is the wacky rig that basically you're going to toss it out, and just like you can see those ends flipping, let it sink to the bottom. Once it gets to the bottom, let it sit there for a second or two. Twitch it up a couple times. Let it sink to the bottom. Let it sit for a second or two. And then what I do, I just reel it in and make another cast. I'm going to throw this wacky rig around the tules. I'm going to throw it around docks, somewhere where I want it specifically sinking right to a target. And I'm not really going to spend the time to work it back out towards the boat. The Texas rig, just the opposite. You throw it up there, let it sink to the bottom, and then work it along the bottom back to the boat. Or the bank if you're on the bank. So absolutely no preference between these two. It just depends on what the fish want to do that day. Hook size for the Texas rig on the 5-inch, probably a 2/0 is big enough. Some people prefer the extra wide gap, and it's worked fine for me, but I actually prefer just a straight shank worm hook. Just seems like I hook more fish with it. It's not like I live and die by Senkos. It's something I have to force myself to throw, but there is no doubt about it. This time of year, they produce absolute big fish. A lot of guys will throw the 6-incher. Some will even go up to the 7-incher. I stick with the 5-inch just out of simplicity. I did buy a great big bag from Tackle Warehouse a couple years ago. I think a 100-pack, maybe 50 or 100-pack of a 6-inch, and I'm still working off that bag. So, as far as plastics are concerned, those are probably the two main ones that I'd be fishing this time of year. I'm always going to have a shaky head rigged up, but the reality is, once these fish start moving up onto beds, I really don't fish it as much as the drop shot. I think the drop shot is way more effective. But you know, fish are fish, and sometimes they do stuff different. So that is pretty much going to be the plastic selection that I would head out in the boat with. And my number one is going to be the drop shot by all means, and then the second one would be the Cinco. Ned rig is okay, but I haven't really done quite as well with it. So honestly, the bread and butter is the drop shot. So when you're not fishing, let's say that you can't see the beds. The water's dingy, or it's just not clear enough to where you can see the bottom clearly, or it's one of those deals where, yeah, I'm seeing fish up in 2 feet of water, but they're all 2-pounders, 2.5 pounders, 3-pounders. So you need to switch to something else. You need to fish a little bit deeper water. This is a deal where you just have to cover water. So probably my number one bait for me would be the LV500. This is kind of a ghost bluegill pattern. Some people are just really hung up on one color or another, and I get it, but day in and day out overall, ever since an LV started fishing on this lake, the ghost minnow type color is probably the best color. It just mimics so many different things. So this is kind of a version of that color. You probably can't see it that well, but it's done really well for me. 2 ways to fish it. One's just going down the bank, throwing it out a ways from where you would have been throwing your plastics, and either just a regular retrieve, just like you would in the old days with a rattle trap, or the yo-yo. And the yo-yo can kind of get to be a little bit different this time of year. Sometimes it's a lift it up and drop it. Other times it's kind of a sideways sweep, so you're not really moving the bait really high off the bottom, and kind of a slower speed, so you're just kind of basically picking it up and dragging it for 2 or 3 feet and then dropping it back down on the bottom. Both work, and both will catch a big fish. Again, it's a deal to do kind of out away from the tules themselves, maybe a little bit out in front of docks, some of the more open water areas, but always around areas that you think there's fish spawning. So that would be my number one, but it's a real tight, close race with number two, which would be a shallow running rip bait, something that'll run 3 to 5 feet. This is a little mega bass Vision, and there's, I don't know, 4 or 5 different colors that we've used during the years, and they work really well in the spring. The neat thing about this bait is it's a little bit easier to fish in shallower water. We've caught a lot of fish over the years on Pointer 78s, Pointer 100s, Stacy 90s. For the most part, when the water's lower, the lake's lower like it is this year, I'd stick with the shallower running rip bait. It just seems like it's got a lot more action, and you're not dragging it through the bottom quite as much. We're going to be really close here by the time we get back on the water to where weeds are going to start growing up off the bottom. So you don't really want to be digging something down into those weeds. There's certain times of the year that's a great idea, but this time of year all it is you go whoop whoop and you're covered up with a weed. Now you got to reel it in and make another cast. Another really, really good option that more and more I'll have in the boat this time of year is a chatterbait or blade bait, whatever you want to call it. Some people call these bladed jigs. Some people call them blade baits. It's a chatterbait type bait. So this is kind of a sprayed grass color, which actually comes across in the water kind of looking like a small bass. This particular one that I had tied on has just got a baby bass colored fluke for a trailer. Just seemed like it had a good action to me. There's a lot of different baits that you can use. You can use craw trailers, you can use small swim baits. Again, I really don't want the trailer on this bait to take away from that this is the part I want the fish attacking, all of this. I just want some extra action in there that sends off some additional vibration. some of these baits, you know, with kicker tails and whatnot, I kind of feel like the fish will come up, and if they're not really interested in eating, which they're not this time of year, they're more defensive of their territory, they'll come up and nip at it or just grab a tail and you don't get the hook in them. So 3/8 ounce, half ounce. The great thing about this is you can go through those areas, you know, where you know fish are spawning, and you can cover water pretty quickly with them. You know, you can do one of two retrieves. You can either do the, you know, lift and drop deal, or another version of it, which is you're reeling it along and all of a sudden you just kill it, let it drop for a second or two, and then pick it right back up, reeling again. Or you can just reel it in at a steady pace. Either way, chatterbait is a really good bait, and it's one that I would have tied on this next month. And then probably the last one, just because I've decided a couple years ago I'm not going to ever go out any time of the year anymore without one, is a little underspin of some sort, whether it's got an actual blade on it, which makes it an underspin, or just the Kitech swim bait on a jig head of some sort. Either one of those two. Just, again, it's another option for being able to go down a bank while you're looking and casting, keeping a bait in the water while you're looking for fish. Sometimes it helps you by figuring out that there's more fish out 10, 15 feet out past your boat than they are the other direction where you're actually looking for them. The other thing I want to mention real quick with the, going back to the Senko, this thing, my wife and I actually almost won a tournament one time on Clear Lake here, a one bass tournament if I remember correctly. And the way that we did it is, I was going down the bank looking for beds, then she would help fish for the bed fish. But while I was going down the bank, instead of really hauling fanny, I was maybe on 40, and just, I would throw a Senko up way ahead of the boat and then forget about it, just let it sink, keep moving, keep looking for fish, keep looking for beds. Well, I caught several key fish that way that day, including our biggest fish, which was, if I remember correctly, it was a little over 7 pounds, which is why we ended up being in second. But that's a killer way to look for beds this time of year. There's two ways to look for beds. One is put the trolling motor on 90 and just go hauling down the bank until you find a fish you want to fish for. The other way is, I know, you're bored to death, sorry. The other way is to just go down the bank at a little bit slower speed, throwing that bait up ahead. And sometimes you just drop it on one's head, or especially in an area where you're fishing docks, you throw it up against a dock or towards a dock, shade of the dock, and those fish, just because you're so far away, they're a little bit freer to come forward and grab that thing and take off with it. So it's kind of a funny feeling. You're going down the bank making really super long casts, and then you reel up to see if you got anything on. Well, one of those casts, you reel up and all of a sudden you realize your line is headed out the other way from the dock where it landed. So it's like, that works. Those are kind of like free fish. So that is how I'm pretty much going to attack it. Hopefully we'll be able to get back on the water in May. The only other thing that I can tell you about May is a lot of times the keys have already gone off by then, and there's a lot of fish down there that are already in post spawn, and especially once you start getting towards the middle of the month, that's kind of when the frog bite turns on down there, at least from my experience. I've made no bones about the fact that I don't spend a lot of time in the keys. It just doesn't set up well for me the way I like to fish. I've gone down there when I've had to, and Jim and I should have won a tournament down there one time in May. I lost an 8-pounder. I just couldn't hit this one spot that just looked like it was the right place, and we hit it 3 different times, and the third time finally got the fish to bite on a frog, and got it almost all the way back to the boat, lost it. So, you know, that's the story of tournament fishing. You lose a big fish and you usually don't win the tournament. So I think that's going to be it for today. So thanks for watching. If you got any questions, comments, please feel free to shoot them to me. Hopefully those of you who have are noticing that I do respond back. Let's put it this way, what else is there to do? So we may as well talk about fishing, huh? Ross England, Clear Lake Guide Service, behave yourselves. This too will pass.